At 74, Morgan Adams stood in the pouring rain with nothing but a worn suitcase and a silence that cut deeper than the cold. Behind him, the door slammed shut, final unshaken. Inside, his own son Ethan turned away without a second glance, while Helen's trembling hand slipped from Morgan's grasp. 40 years of memories, erased in a single night. No neighbors spoke. No one intervened. By morning, the couple had vanished, swallowed by an abandoned tunnel beneath the city. And behind a crumbling wall, deep in that darkness, waited something no one was ever supposed to find. If you've ever been cast aside by the people you trusted most, stay with this story, because sometimes what's hidden in the darkest places can change everything. Morgan Adams had never imagined that the life he spent decades building would end with a single piece of paper. To anyone passing by their honest apartment complex in downtown Cleveland, the Adams family looked ordinary, quiet, stable, unremarkable. But behind that simplicity was a lifetime of sacrifice, resilience, and unwavering commitment. Morgan had been a construction worker for over 45 years. His hands, now trembling and lined with deep creases, once carried steel beams, laid foundations, and helped raise the very skyline that now seemed to forget him. Every building he worked on held a piece of his strength, his sweat, and his belief that hard work meant security. Helen Adams had been the heart of everything. She worked part-time at a local diner for years, waking before dawn, coming home with tired feet, but a warm smile. She made their small apartment feel like a sanctuary, every curtain stitched by hand, every meal prepared with care, every corner filled with quiet love. Together they raised their only son, Ethan. And for a long time, Ethan was their pride. As a child, Ethan used to wait by the door every evening, running into Morgan's arms the moment he returned from work. Helen would watch them with a soft smile, believing that no matter how hard life became, they had something unbreakable. But time has a way of reshaping people. Ethan grew up determined to escape the life his parents had lived. He didn't want worn-out hands or late nights worrying about bills. He wanted more success, recognition, control. And Morgan and Helen supported him every step of the way. They emptied their savings to help him through college. Morgan worked overtime even into his 60s, ignoring the pain in his joints just to make sure Ethan never had to struggle the way he did. Helen picked up extra shifts, quietly cutting back on her own needs so their son could chase his dreams. For years, their sacrifices felt worth it. Ethan graduated with honors. He entered the world of real estate development, a field that promised power and profit. He was ambitious, sharp, and relentless. The kind of man who saw opportunities where others saw limitations. At first, he stayed close. He visited often, bringing expensive gifts that made Helen uncomfortable but secretly proud. He spoke about projects, about deals, about changing the city. Morgan didn't always understand the details, but he listened, nodding with quiet admiration. But slowly, something changed. The visits became less frequent. The phone calls shorter. The warmth colder. Helen noticed it first. She would sit by the window some evenings, watching the street below, hoping to see Ethan's car pull up like he used to. Morgan noticed too, but he said nothing. Because Deep down, he didn't want to believe it. Then came the project. Ethan's biggest opportunity yet, a massive redevelopment plan aimed at transforming older neighborhoods into modern commercial spaces. Investors were involved. City officials were watching. It was the kind of deal that could define his entire career. There was just one problem: the land. The area targeted for redevelopment included several aging apartment complexes, including the one Morgan and Helen had called home for over 40 years. At first, Ethan didn't mention it. He spoke in general terms about urban renewal, about revitalizing communities, about progress. His words were polished, persuasive, but distant. Helen listened, her brow slightly furrowed, a quiet unease settling in her chest. Morgan, on the other hand, felt something deeper: recognition. He had seen this before, projects that promised progress but erased lives in the process. He had been one of the men who built over old neighborhoods, watching families move out their stories, left behind in dust and debris. But never had he imagined being on the other side of it. The truth arrived, not from Ethan, but in the form of an official letter. It came on a quiet Tuesday morning, slipped beneath their door without ceremony. Helen found it first. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling as she read the words once, then twice, as if hoping they would change. Notice of eviction. The phrase sat on the page like a sentence. Her breath caught. "Morgan?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He looked up from his chair, immediately sensing something was wrong. When he took the paper from her hands, the world seemed to grow quiet. Each word struck him harder than the last. Mandatory relocation, property acquisition, deadline, no room for negotiation, no acknowledgement of history, just a timeline, counting down the end of their life there. Helen shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. This must be a mistake," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Morgan didn't answer right away, because deep down, he already knew. He recognized the company name printed at the top of the letter. It was Ethan's. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Helen's mind raced, searching for an explanation that made sense. He wouldn't do this to us. She said more to herself than to Morgan. Morgan folded the letter carefully, placing it on the table as if it were something fragile or dangerous. "I think," he began, his voice steady but distant, "he already has." Helen stared at him, disbelief etched into every line of her face. "No," she said firmly. Ethan wouldn't choose a project over his own parents. Morgan met her gaze, and for a moment something in his eyes shifted, something quiet but unmistakably broken. "He didn't choose the project," Morgan said slowly. "He chose who he wanted to become." The room felt colder after that. Days passed, but the weight of the letter never lifted. Helen tried calling Ethan multiple times. Each attempt went unanswered. When he finally did respond, it wasn't with a visit. It was a brief message. "We'll talk soon. I'm busy." Busy. The word echoed in Helen's mind, hollow and sharp. Morgan said little during those days. He spent hours sitting by the window, watching the city he had helped build, now feeling like a stranger in it. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories drifting through his mind like shadows. The first night they moved into that apartment. Ethan's childhood laughter filling the rooms. The countless evenings spent believing they had built something lasting. All of it now reduced to a deadline. The notice remained on the table unmoved, a quiet reminder that time was running out. And somewhere deep within Morgan, something began to shift, not just pain, but understanding, because he realized something Helen still refused to accept. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a decision. One that would soon force them to confront a truth far more devastating than losing their home. They were no longer part of their son's world. The day Ethan finally came to see them, the air inside the apartment felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Helen had been up since early morning, moving quietly from room to room. She straightened things that didn't need straightening, wiped down surfaces already clean, and paused more than once to steady her hands. Somewhere deep inside her, hope still lingered, fragile, stubborn, refusing to let go. Morgan watched her from his chair by the window. He understood what she was doing, and he understood why. Because for Helen, this wasn't just about a house. It was about their son. When the knock finally came, it startled them both. Helen froze for a moment, her heart pounding so loudly it felt like it filled the room. Then she moved quickly toward the door, almost afraid that if she hesitated, the moment would disappear. She opened it. Ethan stood there, perfectly composed. His coat was expensive, tailored to fit him with effortless precision. His posture was straight, confident. There was no trace of uncertainty in his expression, only a calm, controlled distance that made Helen's chest tighten. "Mama," he said, his tone polite but unfamiliar. Helen forced a smile, though her eyes were already searching his face for something, anything, that felt like the son she remembered. "Ethan," she breathed out. "You came." He stepped inside without hesitation, his gaze briefly scanning the apartment before settling into something unreadable. Morgan remained seated, his eyes fixed on Ethan. There was no anger in his expression, only quiet recognition. Ethan nodded slightly. "Dad." The word felt formal, detached, not like it used to. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick with everything that had been left unsaid. Helen broke it first. "Sit down," she said quickly. "I'll make some coffee. You must be tired." "There's no need," Ethan replied, his voice calm but firm. "I won't be staying long." The words landed harder than he intended, or perhaps exactly as he intended. Helen's smile faltered, but she nodded anyway, her hands clasping together in front of her, as if to keep them from trembling. Morgan leaned forward slightly. "Then say what you came to say," he said quietly. Ethan met his father's gaze. For a brief second, something flickered in his eyes. but it disappeared just as quickly. This situation, Ethan began choosing his words carefully, is complicated. Helen shook her head immediately. No, it isn't, she said, her voice soft but urgent. There's been some kind of mistake. We received a letter, but it's not a mistake. Ethan interrupted. The room went still. Helen blinked as if she hadn't heard him correctly. What do you mean? She whispered. Ethan exhaled slowly. The property has been acquired, he said. The entire block is being redeveloped. It's already finalized. Helen stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. But this is our home, she said. We've lived here for 40 years. You grew up here, Ethan. I know. He cut in again, his tone tightening slightly. And for the first time, a hint of impatience surfaced. That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you directly. I can arrange compensation. A relocation package. Something better than this place. Better? Helen repeated, her voice breaking. Her eyes moved around the apartment, the worn furniture, the faded photographs, the small details that held a lifetime of memories. This is our life, she said. There's nothing better than that. Ethan's jaw tightened. You're not understanding the bigger picture, he said. This project is important. It's not just about one building. It's about the future of the city. Morgan let out a quiet breath. And what about the past? He asked. Ethan looked at him, his expression hardening. The past doesn't build anything, he replied. It holds people back. The words hit Helen like a physical blow. Morgan, however, didn't flinch, because in that moment he understood something clearly. This wasn't the son they had raised, or maybe it was, just a version they had never wanted to see. So, that's it, Morgan said calmly. We're just another obstacle in your way. Ethan hesitated, only for a second. It's not personal, he said. Helen's breath caught. Not personal, she repeated, her voice rising slightly. We're your parents. Ethan looked away briefly, as if searching for patience. And I'm trying to help you, he said. You'll get money. You can move somewhere better, safer. We don't want money, Helen cried. The emotion in her voice filled the room, raw and unfiltered. We want our home. We want our son. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan's expression shifted not with guilt, but with discomfort, because Helen's words weren't part of the conversation he had prepared for. Morgan stood slowly, his movements deliberate. For a moment he simply looked at Ethan, really looked at him, at the man his son had become. You made this decision a long time ago, didn't you? Morgan said. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Morgan nodded slightly. I see, he murmured. Helen turned to Morgan, her eyes filled with desperation. Say something, she pleaded. Make him understand. Morgan's gaze remained on Ethan. I understand perfectly, he said. Then after a pause, he added quietly, That's what scares me. Ethan straightened, his composure returning like a shield. I didn't come here to argue, he said. You have 30 days. I suggest you start preparing. 30 days. The number echoed in Helen's mind like a countdown. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, Ethan, please. But he was already stepping toward the door. He said, his voice softer now, almost rehearsed. This is for the best? She reached out her hand, trembling. For who, she asked. Ethan didn't answer, because he didn't have one, or maybe he did, and he just couldn't say it out loud. He opened the door. For a brief moment he hesitated, as if something inside him was pulling him back. But then he stepped outside, and the door closed behind him. The sound was final, sharp, unforgiving. Helen stood there staring at the door, as if it might open again, as if Ethan might walk back in and say it was all a mistake. But it didn't. It remained closed, locked, and with it, something inside her shattered. Morgan walked over slowly, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. She didn't turn around. Maybe he'll come back, she whispered, her voice fragile. Morgan didn't respond right away, because he knew the truth. And it wasn't something Helen was ready to hear. He already left, Morgan said quietly. Not just the apartment, not just the moment, but them. Days later, when the deadline arrived, there were no second chances. No last-minute calls, no change of heart, just silence. On the final night, rain fell steadily over the city. Morgan carried their single suitcase. Helen held onto his arm, her steps slow, uncertain. They paused one last time in front of the door, the place that had once been their world. Helen reached out, touching the surface gently, as if saying goodbye. Morgan watched her, his expression calm, but his eyes filled with something deeper than sadness. Acceptance. Ready? He asked softly. Helen nodded, but her heart wasn't. Together they stepped away, and behind them the door closed once more. This time, forever. The city did not notice when Morgan and Helen Adams disappeared. Traffic still roared through the streets. Neon signs flickered to life as night settled in. People hurried past one another, wrapped in their own lives, their own worries, unaware that just below their feet, 2 lives had quietly slipped through the cracks. Rain followed them as they walked, not the kind that came in violent bursts, but a steady cold drizzle that soaked through clothing and settled into bones. Morgan held the single suitcase in one hand, the other resting gently over Helen's trembling fingers. She walked beside him, but not quite present, her gaze unfocused, her steps uncertain. Every now and then, she would glance back, as if expecting to see something, someone. But the street behind them remained empty. No car slowing down, no voice calling their names, no sun returning. The further they walked, the quieter the city became. The bright storefronts gave way to dim alleyways, then to long stretches of neglected pavement where streetlights flickered and shadows lingered. Helen finally spoke. "Where are we going?" she asked softly. Morgan didn't answer right away, Because he wasn't just choosing a place. He was choosing what came next. "I know somewhere," he said after a moment. She looked at him, searching his face for reassurance. "What kind of place?" Morgan hesitated. "Not somewhere people go," he admitted. Helen's grip tightened around his arm. "But somewhere we can stay," he added gently. It wasn't much of a promise, but it was enough. They turned down a narrow path at the edge of an industrial district, an area long forgotten by the city's rapid growth. Rusted fences lined the perimeter. Old warehouses stood silent, their windows shattered or boarded up, their purpose long abandoned. The air smelled different here. Damp, metallic, still. Morgan slowed as they approached a section of crumbling concrete wall, partially hidden by overgrown weeds. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about it, just another neglected corner in a city full of them. But Morgan knew better. He stepped closer, pushing aside the weeds, with his foot revealing a rusted metal grate, barely large enough for a person to pass through. Helen stared at it. "What is that?" she asked. Morgan set the suitcase down. "An entrance," he said, "to where he met her eyes, to somewhere the city forgot." Helen hesitated. Every instinct told her to turn back, to find somewhere else. But there was nowhere else. Morgan crouched down, gripping the edge of the grate. It resisted at first the metal groaning with disuse, but after a moment, it gave way with a harsh scrape. A dark opening revealed itself beneath. Cold air drifted up from below, stale damp, carrying the scent of earth and something older. Helen stepped back slightly. "Morgan," she whispered. "It's safe," he said, though his voice carried a weight that suggested otherwise. He picked up the suitcase and began to lower himself inside. For a brief moment, Helen stood frozen. The world above her, the city, the life she had known, felt distant already. And the darkness below. It felt final. But then Morgan looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw something steady, something that hadn't broken. Trust. Slowly she nodded and followed him down. The tunnel swallowed them almost immediately. The faint light from above faded as Morgan pulled the grate back into place, sealing the entrance behind them. For a moment, there was only darkness, thick, absolute pressing in from every direction. Helen's breath quickened. "I can't see anything," she said. Morgan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small flashlight. It flickered once, then steadied, casting a narrow beam through the darkness. The tunnel stretched ahead, long and uneven. The walls were rough concrete, stained with time and moisture. Pipes ran along the ceiling, some corroded, others dripping slowly. The ground beneath their feet was damp, scattered with debris and patches of standing water. Helen wrapped her arms around herself. "It's so cold," she murmured. Morgan moved closer to her. "It won't always feel like this," he said. But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. It might. They walked slowly, their footsteps echoing softly in the confined space. Every sound seemed amplified, the drip of water, the scrape of shoes, the quiet rhythm of their breathing. To Helen, it felt like stepping into another world. one where time had stopped, where no one existed. And for the first time since the door had closed behind them, the weight of everything began to settle in. "We're really here," she said quietly. Morgan glanced at her. "Yes. This is where we live now." The question hung in the air. Morgan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he scanned the tunnel ahead as if searching for something familiar. Because, to him, this place wasn't entirely unknown. "I worked down here," he said finally. Helen looked at him, surprised. "When?" "Years ago," he replied, "before they sealed most of it off. Back when the city was expanding underground. Transport lines, utility systems, all of it." He moved the flashlight along the wall, his eyes narrowing slightly. "There were sections we weren't allowed to talk about," he added. "Areas that didn't make it into official plans." Helen frowned. "What do you mean?" Morgan shook his head slightly. "I don't know everything," he admitted, "but I remember enough." They continued walking until the tunnel widened into a larger chamber, an old maintenance area, long abandoned. Broken equipment lay scattered across the floor. A rusted workbench leaned against one wall. The ceiling rose slightly higher, allowing for a small sense of space. Morgan set the suitcase down. "This will do," he said. Helen looked around. The emptiness of the space was overwhelming. This is it?" she asked. "For now," Morgan replied gently. She sank onto a piece of debris, her shoulders slumping. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then quietly, "I never thought it would end like this." Morgan sat beside her. "Neither did I." They sat in silence, the weight of their new reality pressing down on them. Above them, the city continued, as if nothing had changed. But down here, everything had. After a while, Helen spoke again. "Do you think he'll come looking for us?" Morgan didn't answer right away, because he knew the answer. But saying it out loud would make it real. "I don't know," he said finally. Helen nodded slowly, but her eyes told a different story. She did know, and it hurt more than anything else. Morgan leaned back against the cold wall, his gaze drifting across the chamber. And then, something caught his attention. A section of the wall partially hidden behind old equipment, different from the rest, smoother, more deliberate. He stood slowly, walking toward it. Helen watched him, confused. "What is it?" Morgan reached out, running his hand across the surface. The concrete here felt newer, stronger, sealed. His expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. "Recognition." "I remember this," he murmured. Helen stood, moving closer. "Remember what?" Morgan stepped back slightly, studying the wall more carefully. "This wasn't supposed to be here," he said. The words sent a quiet chill through the air. "What do you mean?" Helen asked. Morgan didn't look at her, because his mind was already somewhere else, back in the past, piecing together fragments he hadn't thought about in decades. "There was an order," he said slowly. "Back when we were working on this section, a part of the tunnel was closed off. No explanation, just instructions to seal it. Helen's breath caught. "And this is it?" she asked. Morgan nodded. "I think so." The flashlight beam flickered slightly as he moved it along the edges of the wall. No markings, no signs, just a barrier. One that wasn't meant to be questioned. But now, it was the only thing that felt like it mattered. Helen looked at the wall, then back at Morgan. "What's behind it?" Morgan didn't answer, because he didn't know. But something deep inside him stirred. Not fear, not hesitation, something else. Purpose. And for the first time since they had been cast out into the rain, Morgan Adams felt something shift within him. They had lost everything above ground, but down here, there was still something left to uncover. Morgan didn't sleep that night, even as Helen drifted into a restless, fragile sleep beside him, curled against the cold floor, with her coat wrapped tightly around her. His eyes remained open, fixed on the darkness beyond the narrow beam of the flashlight, or more precisely, on the wall. It stood there in silence, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But Morgan knew, and that made all the difference. There was something wrong about it, not visibly, not in a way that would alarm anyone at first glance, but to a man who had spent decades working with concrete, steel, and structure, the difference was unmistakable. The rest of the tunnel bore the marks of age, cracks, stains, erosion. Time had left its signature everywhere. But this wall, it was intact, deliberate, almost untouched. Morgan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared at it. His mind drifted back, years, decades, trying to pull together memories that had long been buried under routine and survival. He remembered the day, not clearly at first, but in fragments. A supervisor speaking in hushed tones, a group of workers being reassigned without explanation, instructions given quickly, and questions discouraged. Morgan had been younger then, stronger, less inclined to question authority. He had done what he was told. They all had. Seal the section. Don't ask why. Don't come back. At the time, it had felt strange, but not enough to resist. Because back then, Morgan had something to lose. A job, a family, a future. Now, he had nothing left, and that changed everything. By morning, the cold had settled deeper into the tunnel. Helen stirred slowly, her body stiff, her movements careful. She sat up, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders as she adjusted to the dim light. For a moment, she looked disoriented. Then reality returned. The tunnel. The silence. The absence of everything they had lost. Her eyes found Morgan. He hadn't moved. "Morgan," she said softly. He turned toward her, his expression calm, but distant. "You didn't sleep," she observed. He shook his head. "Not much." Helen followed his gaze. To the wall. Something in her chest tightened. "You're still thinking about it," she said. "Yes." There was no hesitation in his answer. Helen wrapped her arms around herself. I don't like it, she admitted. There's something about it. It feels wrong. Morgan stood slowly, walking toward the wall once more. That's because it is, he said. Helen watched him unease, settling deeper. What if it's dangerous? She asked. Morgan ran his hand along the surface, again feeling the cold, smooth texture beneath his fingers. Everything is dangerous, he replied quietly, including staying here and doing nothing. Helen stood as well, though more slowly. We don't even know what's behind it, she said. Morgan turned to face her. No, he agreed. But I know one thing. What if someone went to this much trouble to hide it? He paused, his eyes steady. Then, whatever's behind it matters. The words hung in the air. Helen looked at him, searching for doubt. She didn't find any. Instead, she saw something she hadn't seen in days. Determination. It frightened her. But at the same time, it gave her something she thought she had lost. A reason to keep going. What are you going to do? She asked. Well, Morgan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the scattered debris in the chamber, scanning the broken tools and rusted pieces of metal left behind. After a moment, he picked up a length of pipe, heavy worn, but still solid enough to use. Helen's breath caught. Morgan? He tested its weight in his hands. It won't be easy, he said, and it won't be quick. She stepped closer. And if we're wrong, she asked. Morgan met her eyes. Then we'll know, he said simply. Helen hesitated. Fear pulled at her, strong, insistent, urging her to stop him. But something else pushed Miyake. Something quieter, but stronger. The realization that they had already lost everything. What more was there to fear? She took a slow breath, then nodded. Then we do it together. Morgan studied her for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Together. He turned back to the wall, gripping the pipe firmly. For a brief second, he paused. Not out of hesitation, but out of understanding. This wasn't just about the wall. It was about everything it represented. The past, the truth, the part of the world that had been hidden from them, just like they had been hidden from their son's life. Then he swung. The sound echoed through the tunnel, sharp and jarring, metal against concrete. The impact sent a vibration through his arms, a dull ache settling into his bones. The wall didn't crack, not yet, but it responded. A faint arc appeared where the pipe had struck. Helen flinched at the sound, her heart racing. Morgan didn't stop. He swung again and again, each strike louder than the last, echoing deeper into the darkness. Time began to blur. Minutes stretched into hours. The rhythm of the blows became steady, almost mechanical, driven by something deeper than effort alone. Driven by purpose. Helen watched, at first her hands clasped tightly in front of her. But after a while, she moved closer. Let me help, she said. Morgan hesitated. You don't have to. I want to, she interrupted. He looked at her, really looked at her, at the fear still lingering in her eyes, but also at the strength beginning to rise beneath it. Without another word, he handed her the pipe. She gripped it tightly, her hands trembling slightly as she raised it. For a moment she closed her eyes. Then she struck. The impact startled her, the force of it stronger than she expected. But she didn't step back. Instead, she adjusted her grip and struck again. And again. Each blow carried something with it. The pain, the betrayal, the loss. Everything that had been taken from them. Morgan watched her, something shifting inside him. Pride, respect, a quiet understanding that they weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting. The wall began to change, slowly, subtly. Cracks formed thin at first, then spreading outward like veins across the surface. Dust fell in small bursts with each impact. The sound of breaking concrete replaced the dull thud of resistance. Helen's breathing grew heavier, her movements slower, but she didn't stop. Morgan stepped in when her arms began to weaken, taking the pipe back and continuing the work. Together they chipped away at the barrier, piece by piece, layer by layer, until finally a sharp crack split through the wall, louder than anything before. Morgan froze. Helen's eyes widened. The air seemed to shift, change. A small section of the wall broke inward, a chunk of concrete falling to the ground with a hollow thud. Behind it, darkness, deeper than the tunnel, different. Morgan lowered the pipe, slowly stepping closer. Helen moved beside him, her heart pounding. "What is that?" she whispered. Morgan didn't answer, because he didn't need to. He reached forward, brushing away loose debris, with his hands widening the opening just enough to see through. The flashlight beam slipped inside, and for the first time, it revealed something beyond the wall. Not just empty space, but structure. A hidden chamber, sealed, forgotten, waiting. Morgan's breath slowed, his mind racing. Because whatever was behind that wall, it had been hidden for a reason. And now they had found it. For a long moment, neither Morgan nor Helen moved. The whole hole in the wall, jagged, uneven, barely wide enough to peer through, felt like a threshold between two worlds. On one side, the cold, abandoned tunnel that had become their refuge. On the other, something unknown. Morgan lifted the flashlight, slightly angling the beam through the opening. The light disappeared into the darkness, at first swallowed whole. Then shapes began to form. Not natural, not random, deliberate. There were walls beyond the wall. A room. Helen inhaled sharply. "That's not part of the tunnel," she whispered. Morgan shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "It's not." He set the pipe down and knelt, clearing more debris from the opening with his hands. The concrete crumbled under his touch, now weakened by years and their relentless effort. Each piece that fell widened the gap. Each inch revealed more. The smell changed first. A stale, enclosed scent like air that hadn't been disturbed in decades drifted out from the hidden space. It carried a weight with it, something heavy and quiet. Forgotten. Morgan paused, listening. No sound came from within. No movement, just silence. Helen stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "Are you sure we should go in?" she asked. Her voice wasn't filled with fear anymore, But it wasn't free of it either. Morgan glanced back at her. "No," he admitted. "I'm not sure." Then he looked at the opening again. "But I know we didn't come this far to turn around." Helen followed his gaze, and slowly she nodded. Morgan widened the hole just enough to fit through, then carefully pulled himself inside. The moment his feet touched the ground on the other side, something shifted. The air felt different. Still cold, but less exposed. Contained. He turned, reaching back to help Helen through. She hesitated only briefly before taking his hand, allowing him to guide her into the hidden space. Once inside, they both stood still, adjusting, listening. Morgan raised the flashlight again, sweeping the beam slowly across the room. What it revealed made Helen's breath catch. It wasn't just a chamber. It was a constructed room, deliberately built and then concealed. The walls were reinforced smoother than the tunnel outside. The ceiling was supported by thick steel beams, still intact despite the years. Dust covered every surface undisturbed, as if time itself had stopped the moment the space was sealed. In the center of the room stood a heavy metal table, and beyond it, cabinets, shelves, boxes, not debris, not forgotten trash, but organized, intentional. Morgan stepped forward cautiously, his boots echoing softly against the floor. "This wasn't abandoned," he murmured. "It was hidden." Helen wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes scanning the room. "Why would anyone hide something like this?" she asked. Morgan didn't answer right away, because the answer was beginning to form on its own. He approached the table, brushing away a layer of dust with his hand. Underneath, documents, stacks of them, yellowed with age, but preserved. Helen moved beside him, her curiosity overcoming her hesitation. "What are they?" she asked. Morgan picked up the top sheet carefully. His eyes moved across the page slowly at first, then faster. His expression changed. "What is it?" Helen asked, her voice tightening. Morgan didn't look up. "These are blueprints," he said. "For what?" He turned the paper, slightly angling the flashlight to get a clearer view. "The city," he replied. Helen frowned. "That doesn't make sense." Morgan reached for another document, then another. Each one confirmed it. Structural diagrams, foundation maps, underground layouts. Not just general plans, but detailed schematics of the city's infrastructure. Water lines, support beams, load-bearing zones, and something else, markings. Certain areas were circled, highlighted, annotated. Morgan's grip tightened slightly. "These aren't just plans," he said quietly. "They're warnings." Helen's heart began to race. Warnings about what? Morgan spread several pages out across the table, piecing them together like a puzzle. "About failure," he said. "Structural failure." Helen stared at the papers, trying to understand. "You mean buildings collapsing?" Morgan shook his head. "Not just buildings," he said. "Sections of the city." The words hung in the air, heavy. and impossible. Helen stepped back slightly. That can't be right. Morgan didn't respond, because he was already seeing it. The connections, the patterns, the truth hidden beneath layers of ink and time. These markings, he said slowly, they're not random. They're showing stress points, weaknesses in the foundation. Helen's voice trembled. Why would someone hide this? Morgan's eyes darkened. Because fixing it would cost too much, he said. The realization settled over them like a shadow. This wasn't just forgotten information. It was buried truth, deliberately concealed. Morgan moved toward the cabinets, opening one carefully. Inside, more documents, more files, and a locked metal box. Helen noticed it immediately. What's that? Morgan lifted it out, setting it on the table. It's a safe, he said. There was no key, but the lock was old, worn. Helen looked at him. Can you open it? Morgan studied it for a moment, then nodded. Maybe. He searched the room quickly, finding a rusted tool among the scattered equipment, a small pry bar. Carefully, deliberately, he worked at the lock. It resisted at first. Then, with a sharp snap, it gave way. The lid creaked open. Inside, more papers, but different. Not blueprints, records, correspondence, official documents stamped with seals. Morgan picked one up, his eyes scanning the text, and then he froze. Helen saw it immediately. What is it? She asked. Morgan looked up slowly. This isn't just about the past, he said. Helen stepped closer. Then what is it about? Morgan turned the document toward her. At the top was a company name. Clear, undeniable. Helen's breath caught. Because she recognized it. So did Morgan. It was Ethan's company. The room seemed to close in around them. No, Helen whispered. That's not possible. Morgan didn't speak. He didn't need to, because the evidence was right there. Signed documents, updated reports, recent dates. This wasn't something that had been forgotten decades ago. It was something that had been found and hidden again. Helen shook her head, stepping back. He wouldn't be part of this. Morgan's voice was quiet. But he is. The truth settled between them heavier than anything they had faced before. Their son hadn't just taken their home. He had built his success on something far worse. A secret that could destroy more than just buildings. It could destroy lives. Morgan looked back at the documents, his mind racing, because now he understood the redevelopment project, the urgency, the silence. Ethan wasn't just building something new, he was covering something up. Helen's voice trembled. What happens if this is true? Morgan didn't answer immediately, because he was already thinking ahead. Seen the consequences, the scale, the city, he said slowly. It's not safe. Helen's eyes filled with fear. Then people need to know. Morgan looked at her. And in that moment, the weight of everything came crashing down. Because telling the truth would mean destroying their son. But staying silent could destroy everything else. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. And for the first time since they had entered the tunnel, Morgan Adams realized that what they had found wasn't just a secret. It was a choice, one that would change everything. The silence inside the hidden chamber felt heavier than anything Morgan and Helen Adams had ever experienced. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of consequences waiting to be spoken. The documents lay scattered across the metal table. Blueprints, reports, sealed correspondence, each one carrying a weight that no longer belonged to paper alone. It belonged to truth. And truth, once uncovered, never stayed contained. Helen stood motionless, her eyes fixed on Ethan's company name printed at the top of the report. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first. It was as if her mind refused to translate what her eyes were seeing. Finally, she whispered, almost broken, "This can't be real?" Morgan didn't respond immediately. He was still reading, still connecting pieces that refused to stay separate anymore. Structural warnings, ignored inspections, reinforced concealment orders, and most disturbing of all, recent signatures. Not decades old, recent. Morgan placed the paper down slowly, as if any sudden movement might make it more real than it already was. "It's real," he said quietly. Helen shook her head harder now, stepping back from the table. "No," she insisted. "Ethan is ambitious, yes, but he wouldn't be part of something dangerous. Not like this." Morgan looked at her, and for a moment something in his expression softened. Not doubt, not anger, something closer to sorrow. "People don't always see what they become," he said. Helen's breath trembled. "He's our son," she said again, as if repeating it could undo everything. Morgan turned slightly, scanning the room again. "This room wasn't just sealed," he said. "It was buried. Intentionally. Whoever built this wanted it forgotten." He picked up another file, this one marked with inspection warnings and structural stress analyses. "They knew parts of the city's foundation were unstable," he continued, "and instead of fixing it, they hid it." Helen felt her knees weaken slightly. "So, people are living above something unsafe?" she asked. Morgan nodded slowly. "Yes." The word landed like a crack forming in stone. Helen pressed a hand to her mouth. "How many?" she whispered. Morgan hesitated, then answered honestly, "I don't know." The reality of it expanded inside the chamber like a shadow, growing without light. This wasn't just a hidden room anymore. It was a record of negligence, of silence chosen over responsibility, of profit chosen over people. Helen's voice suddenly sharpened through emotion. "And Ethan is involved in this," Morgan didn't avoid the question. He placed the document down carefully. "Yes," he said. A long silence followed, this one different from the first. This silence was not confusion. It was fracture. Helen sank slowly onto a nearby crate, her hands trembling in her lap. I don't understand," she said quietly. We raised him to do better than us. To be honest, to be good. Her voice broke slightly on the last word. Morgan looked at her, and for the first time since they had entered this place, his voice softened fully. We raised him with everything we had, he said, but the world raised him too. Helen shook her head. No, there has to be another explanation. But even as she said it, her voice carried less certainty, more fear. Morgan turned back to the table, scanning one of the larger maps again. His finger traced a marked section. This area, he said. It's labeled as high-risk structural failure. Helen stood slowly, stepping closer again. And no one fixed it, she asked. Morgan shook his head. They marked it and moved forward anyway. A bitter silence followed. Then Helen spoke again, softer this time. If this collapses, she began. Morgan finished the sentence for her. It won't just be a building. Helen closed her eyes briefly. It will be people. Morgan didn't respond, because there was nothing to soften that truth. The room suddenly felt smaller, heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what they had learned. Helen looked at him again. So what do we do? She asked. It was not a question of fear anymore. It was a question of responsibility. Morgan didn't answer immediately, because this was the part that mattered. The part where knowledge became action, and action came with cost. He leaned against the table thinking. Outside this hidden chamber, they had been discarded, erased, forgotten. But inside it, they had been given something else, truth. And truth did not stay neutral. If we do nothing, Morgan said slowly, people will be in danger and won't even know it. Helen nodded. And if we tell someone, she asked. Morgan looked at her. It will reach Ethan, he said. The weight of that name returned instantly. Helen swallowed hard. He'll lose everything, she whispered. Morgan didn't deny it, because that was also true. The silence stretched again, but this time it was no longer empty. It was divided between family and everything else. Helen walked slowly to the edge of the chamber, placing a hand against the cold wall. I don't want to destroy him, she said quietly. Morgan followed her with his eyes. I know, he said. Helen turned back toward him, tears beginning to form, but not falling. But I also don't want people to die because of silence. Morgan nodded once. That's the choice, he said. A long pause followed. Helen's voice was barely above a whisper now. Is there no way to do both? Morgan looked down at the documents, at the signatures, at the systems, at the machinery of decisions that had led them here. I don't think so, he admitted. The truth settled deep between them like dust. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Morgan straightened. We need proof, he said. Helen looked at him. We already have proof. Morgan shook his head. Not enough, he said. Not for them to listen. He tapped the documents. This has to be undeniable. If we go above ground with this, they'll bury it again unless it's airtight. Helen understood what he meant. This isn't just about truth, she said slowly. Morgan met her gaze. It's about survival, he said. A faint tremor ran through the chamber, not physical, but emotional, because suddenly the tunnel didn't feel like an escape anymore. It felt like a crossroads. Helen stepped back toward the table. Her hands hovered over the documents. Then slowly, she began organizing them. Morgan watched her. "You've decided?" he said quietly. She didn't look up immediately. "I don't want to," she replied. Then she paused. "But I can't ignore this." Morgan nodded. Something inside him settled. Not relief, not certainty, but alignment. Two people who had lost everything above ground, now holding something that could change everything above it. Helen looked up at him. "If we do this," she said. Morgan finished her thought again. "There's no going back." The words lingered, heavier than before. Helen nodded once. "I know." Outside the chamber, somewhere far above them, the city continued to move, unaware cars, lights, voices, lives, unfolding in ignorance of what lay beneath. But down here, a decision had been made. Morgan carefully gathered the documents into a stack. Helen helped him without speaking. Their movements were slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. Not because they were ready, but because they had chosen. As they finished, Helen paused for a moment, holding one of the reports. Her voice softened. "Do you think Ethan will understand?" Morgan looked at her, and for the first time, there was no answer that felt safe. "I don't know," he said honestly. Then after a pause, "But I hope he does." Helen nodded faintly, then closed the folder. Above them, the city still slept. But beneath it, something had already begun to change. Morning came without sunlight. Down in the hidden chamber, time moved differently, measured not by clocks, but by the slow drip of water through unseen pipes and the faint hum of a city that no longer knew they existed beneath it. Morgan Adams had already begun working. He sat at the metal table, carefully spreading out the documents they had gathered. The flashlight lay angled against a rusted bracket, casting a steady beam across maps and reports. His hands moved with purpose, now sorting, aligning, tracing connections that had once been invisible. Helen watched him quietly. There was something different about him this morning. Not stronger, but clearer. The confusion that had clouded the last few days, the shock, the grief had settled into something sharper. Understanding. Helen wrapped her coat tighter around herself and stepped closer. "You've been at it all night again," she said softly. Morgan didn't look up. "I had to see it," he replied. "See what?" He tapped a section of the blueprint, the pattern. Helen leaned in, her brow furrowing. "What kind of pattern?" Morgan shifted the papers slightly, revealing several marked zones connected by thin lines drawn in faded ink. "These aren't random weak points," he explained. "They're connected structurally. If one section fails, it puts pressure on the next." Helen's stomach tightened. Like a chain reaction, Morgan nodded. Yes. The word barbed between them like a warning bell that hadn't yet rung. Helen looked at the map more closely. "Where does it start?" she asked. Morgan hesitated, then pointed. Helen followed his finger, her breath caught, because she recognized the location. "That's," she began. "Our old neighborhood," Morgan finished. The realization hit harder than anything before. The place they had just been forced out of was the first point of failure. Helen stepped back, her hand instinctively reaching for the table to steady herself. "So the redevelopment project," she whispered. Morgan nodded again. "It's not just about profit," he said. "It's about timing." Helen looked at him, confusion and fear mixing together. "What do you mean?" Morgan's voice lowered. "If they rebuild before the failure happens, they can control the narrative," he said. "They can bury the problem under new construction." Helen's eyes widened. "And if they don't?" Morgan didn't answer right away, because the answer didn't need words. It was already written across the blueprints, across the warnings that had been ignored, across the silence that had been chosen. "It collapses," he said finally. Helen's chest tightened. "And people?" Morgan closed his eyes briefly. "People get hurt," he squeezed. The truth no longer felt distant. It felt immediate, real, and dangerously close. A faint tremor ran through the ground beneath them. Barely noticeable, but enough. Helen froze. "Did you feel that?" she asked. Morgan's head lifted sharply. "Yes." They both stood still, listening. The tunnel remained quiet. But something had shifted. A subtle vibration, like the earth adjusting itself, passed through the chamber and then faded. Helen's voice dropped to a whisper. "Is it starting?" Morgan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved back to the table, scanning the documents again. Faster this time, more urgently. Then he found it. A report, recent, marked with internal review notes. He read quickly, then slower, then again. His expression changed. "What is it?" Helen asked. Morgan looked up. They knew, he said, knew that this could happen sooner than expected. Helen felt the room tilt slightly. "And they still didn't warn anyone?" Morgan shook his head. "No." A cold silence filled the chamber, not just from the environment, but from the realization of what they were facing. Helen's voice trembled. "We have to tell someone." Morgan looked at her. "But who?" she asked. Morgan exhaled slowly. "That's the problem." He stood pacing slightly. "If we go to the city officials, they'll deny it. These projects involve too much money, too many people." Helen nodded slowly. "And if we go to the company," Morgan gave a bitter, quiet smile. "They already know," he said. Helen wrapped her arms around herself again. "Then what do we do?" Morgan stopped pacing. And for a moment, he hesitated. Because this was the point where everything became irreversible. "We take it public," he said. Helen blinked. "You mean the media?" Morgan nodded. "It's the only way they won't be able to bury it again." Helen's heart raced. "But we don't even have access to anything up there," she said. No phone, no contacts, nothing. Morgan looked toward the tunnel entrance. "We'll find a way," he said. Before Helen could respond, another tremor. Stronger this time. Dust fell from the ceiling in fine particles. The metal table rattled slightly. Helen gasped, grabbing onto Morgan's arm. "Morgan." "I know," he said quickly. They both looked at the ceiling. The beams held. For now. But the warning was no longer theoretical. It was happening. Above them, the city continued unaware. But below, the signs had begun. Helen's voice broke slightly. "We're running out of time." Morgan nodded. Yes. The weight of that truth pressed down on them harder than the concrete above. Then suddenly, a distant sound. Faint at first, then clearer. Footsteps. Not theirs. Not echoes. Real? Morgan stiffened. Helen's grip tightened. Did you hear that she whispered? Yes. The sound came from the tunnel outside the hidden chamber. Slow, cautious, approaching. Morgan's mind raced. No one knew they were here. No one should have been able to find this place. Unless... He looked at the documents again. At the recent reports. At the connection that now seemed unavoidable. Helen's voice trembled. "Do you think it's—" "Stay behind me," Morgan said quietly. The footsteps grew louder, closer, then stopped, just outside the broken wall. For a moment, everything went still. Even the air seemed to pause. Then a shadow crossed the opening. Morgan's breath slowed. His grip tightened slightly on the edge of the table. Helen held her breath. A voice came from the other side, low, controlled, familiar. "You shouldn't have opened that wall." Helen's heart dropped because she knew that voice. Morgan didn't turn immediately, but he already knew too. Slowly, he faced the opening. And there, standing in the dim light of the tunnel, was Ethan. His expression unreadable, his presence sharp, deliberate. Not surprised, not confused, as if he had been expecting this. Helen stepped forward instinctively. "Ethan," she whispered, but he didn't move toward her. He didn't soften. He just stood there, looking at the two of them, and at the truth they had uncovered. The distance between them had never felt greater. And in that moment, Morgan understood something clearly. This wasn't just about discovery anymore. This was confrontation. Ethan Adams stood at the broken threshold, the jagged edge of concrete framing him like a line no one could cross without consequence. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick, charged, fragile. Helen took a step forward first. "Ethan," she said again, softer this time, as if gentleness might reach him where reason could not. But Ethan didn't move. His eyes shifted from her to Morgan, to the documents spread across the table, and something in his expression tightened. "You found everything he said." It wasn't a question. Morgan stepped forward, slightly positioning himself between Helen and the opening, not aggressively, but instinctively. Yes, he replied. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, there was a something beneath his composure. Not guilt, not fully, but strain. This wasn't supposed to happen, he said. Helen's voice trembled. What wasn't supposed to happen? She asked. Us finding out. Or this existing at all. Ethan's jaw tightened. It's complicated, he said. Morgan's voice cut through the air, quiet, steady, but unyielding. No, he said. It's not. Ethan's eyes snapped to his father. Morgan held his gaze. People are in danger, Morgan continued. You knew that. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped into the chamber slowly, his shoes echoing against the floor. The space seemed smaller with him inside it, more tense. I knew there were risks, he said carefully. Helen shook her head. Risks, she repeated, her voice rising. You call this a risk? She gestured to the documents. These are warnings, Ethan. They're telling you the city could collapse. Ethan's voice hardened. It won't collapse, he said, not if the project is completed on time. Morgan frowned. What do you mean? Ethan stepped closer to the table, pointing at the blueprints. These areas, yes, they're unstable, but the redevelopment plan reinforces them. New foundations, new structures, stronger than what's there now. Helen stared at him, disbelief flooding her expression. And what about the people living there now? She demanded. What about the families who don't know they're sitting on top of something that could give way at any moment? Ethan hesitated, just for a second. Then, they'll be relocated, he said. Morgan let out a slow breath. Just like us, he said. Ethan didn't deny it, because he couldn't. The truth hung there raw and undeniable. Helen's voice broke again. You didn't just move us out, Ethan, she said. You erased us. Ethan looked at her, then really looked. And for a brief moment, something cracked. I gave you options, he said, quieter now. Money, a better place. We didn't want better, she interrupted. We wanted you. The words struck deeper than anything else. Ethan's gaze faltered, but only for a moment. Then the wall came back. You don't understand what I'm trying to do, he said. Morgan's voice was calm. Then explain it. Ethan took a breath, his shoulders tightening. This project isn't just about profit, he said. It's about control. If we don't handle this internally, it becomes a public disaster. Panic, lawsuits. The entire system collapses. Morgan studied him. And so you chose to hide it, he said. Ethan met his eyes. I chose to manage it. Helen let out a bitter laugh through her tears. By risking lives? She asked. Ethan's voice rose slightly. No one is going to die. The words echoed sharply in the chamber. And then, as if the earth itself rejected that certainty, a violent tremor shook the ground beneath them, stronger than before. The walls groaned. Dust cascaded from the ceiling in thick clouds. A deep, distant crack echoed through the tunnel system, like something breaking far away, but close enough to feel. Helen screamed, grabbing onto Morgan. Morgan, he held her steady, his eyes scanning the structure above them. The steel beams shuddered, but held, barely. Ethan staggered slightly, catching himself against the table. For the first time, fear appeared in his eyes. Real fear. Not calculated, not controlled. "Is that?" he began. Morgan's voice cut through, sharp and urgent. "It's starting." The words landed harder than any accusation. Ethan looked around, his breath quickening. "That's not possible," he said. "The timeline." "Your timeline is wrong," Morgan snapped. Another distant rumble followed, less intense, but enough to confirm it. This wasn't theory anymore. It was happening. Helen's voice trembled. "We have to warn people," she said. "Now." Ethan turned toward her. "They won't listen in time," he said. Morgan stepped forward. "They will if the truth is undeniable." Ethan shook his head. "You don't understand how this works. There are layers, processes." "There's no time for processes," Helen cried. The urgency in her voice cut through everything. Ethan fell silent, because deep down, he knew she was right. Morgan moved to the table, gathering the documents quickly. "These are enough," he said. "We take them above ground. We find someone who will listen." Ethan stepped in front of him. "And destroy everything I've built?" he asked. Morgan met his gaze. Better that than letting it destroy everything else. The words struck like a verdict. Ethan's jaw clenched. "You think it's that simple?" he demanded. Morgan didn't hesitate. "Yes." The simplicity of the answer made it harder to fight. Helen stepped forward slowly, her voice softer now, but stronger. "You didn't just abandon us," she said. Ethan looked at her. "You abandoned what's right." The words settled into him, deep, unavoidable. Another tremor rolled through the ground, short, sharp, a warning, a countdown. Ethan looked around the chamber, at the cracked wall, at the falling dust, at the reality closing in, then back at his parents. For the first time since he arrived, he didn't look like the man in control. He looked like someone standing at the edge of something he couldn't stop. "What if it's too late?" he asked quietly. Morgan didn't soften. "Then we make it less late," he said. Silence followed. Heavy, decisive. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. And in that moment, something shifted. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough. When he opened them again, the resistance in his expression had changed. Not gone, but fractured. "I know people," he said slowly. "Media contacts, inspectors. If this goes out fast enough..." Helen's breath caught. "You'll help?" she asked. Ethan didn't answer right away, because the answer meant accepting everything that came with it. "Then yes," he said. The word was quiet, but it carried weight. Morgan studied him. "Are you sure?" he asked. Ethan gave a faint, bitter smile. "No," he admitted. Then he looked at the documents. "At least this way, I won't have to pretend anymore." Another distant rumble echoed through the tunnel. Closer, this time. Morgan moved quickly. "Then we don't waste another second." Helen nodded. Ethan grabbed several files, his movements sharp, now focused. The three of them stood together in that hidden chamber. Not as they once were, but not entirely broken either. Above them, the city continued unaware that its foundation was beginning to fail. Below, the truth had finally found its way out, and there was no turning back. They moved fast. Faster than any of them thought they still could. The tunnel that had once felt endless now became a race against something far more dangerous than distance-time. Morgan led the way, the flashlight cutting through the darkness in sharp, urgent strokes. Helen stayed close behind him, clutching a stack of documents to her chest, as if they were something alive. Ethan followed, his breath heavier than before, his mind racing faster than his steps. Above them, the city was beginning to shift. Not visibly, not yet, but the tremors beneath their feet told the truth, before anything else could. The foundation was weakening, and the clock had already started ticking. "We don't have long," Morgan said, his voice low but steady. Ethan didn't argue. For the first time, he wasn't trying to control the situation. He was trying to keep up with it. They reached the narrow entrance, beneath the rusted grate, the same place Morgan had uncovered only hours before. But now it felt different. Not like an escape, like a passage. Morgan pushed the grate upward, the metal scraping loudly as it gave way. Cold air rushed down into the tunnel, carrying with it the sounds of the city, distant traffic voices, life continuing without awareness. For a moment, all three of them paused, because stepping back into that world meant facing everything they had left behind, and everything they were about to change. Morgan climbed out first, pulling himself onto the damp pavement above. He turned immediately, reaching down to help Helen. She hesitated for only a second before taking his hand. Then she emerged into the gray morning light. Ethan followed last, his movements sharp, purposeful. The street looked almost the same as it had the night before, but now it felt different, because they knew what lay beneath it and what could happen next. Ethan pulled out his phone immediately, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. "I'm calling someone," he said. Morgan watched him carefully. "Someone who will listen?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Someone who can't afford not to." The line rang. Once, twice. Then a voice answered. "Ethan." "It's early." Ethan didn't waste time. "I need you to listen carefully," he said. "There's a structural failure risk across multiple zones in the redevelopment district. I have proof, full documentation." There was a pause on the other end. "Then that's not possible," the voice replied. Ethan's jaw tightened. "It is," he said. "And if we don't act now, parts of the city are going to collapse." Another pause. Longer this time. "Where are you?" the voice asked. Ethan glanced at Morgan and Helen, then gave the location. "Don't move," the voice said. "I'm contacting the network." The call ended. Helen looked at Ethan, her expression uncertain. "Will they believe you?" she asked. Ethan exhaled slowly. "They will, when they see what we have." Morgan didn't speak, but his eyes scanned the street, watching, waiting. Because belief wasn't the only thing they needed. They needed speed. Minutes passed, then sirens. Faint at first, then louder. Helen's breath caught. They're coming. Not just one, multiple. Police vehicles, emergency response units, and then news vans. They arrived quickly, surrounding the area with a sudden burst of movement and sound. People began to gather, confused, curious, unaware. Ethan stepped forward, holding the documents tightly. A man in a dark coat approached mid-50s, sharp eyes, controlled presence. "Ethan Adams," he said. "You'd better be right about this." Ethan handed him the files. "Read it," he said. The man didn't hesitate. He flipped through the documents quickly at first, then slower. His expression changed, subtly, but unmistakably. "How long have you known?" he asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. "Long enough," he said. The man looked up. "That's going to be a problem," he replied. Ethan nodded. "I know." The man turned to the emergency teams. "Start evacuations in the marked zones," he ordered. "Now!" The words spread quickly. Officers moved. Radios crackled. Barriers were set. The city, for the first time, began to respond to a danger it hadn't yet seen. Helen watched it all, her heart pounding. "They're actually doing it," she whispered. Morgan nodded. They had to. But even as he said it, the ground beneath them trembled again, stronger, more violent. A deep cracking sound echoed from somewhere below. And then a distant collapse. Not massive, not yet, but enough to send a ripple of fear through the crowd. People began to panic. What was that? Did you feel that? What's going on? The man in the coat turned sharply. "Move faster!" he shouted. "Clear the area!" Ethan stepped back slightly. His face pale now. "This is earlier than expected," he said. Morgan looked at him. "Your timeline was already broken." Ethan didn't argue, because he could feel it now. This wasn't something he could manage anymore. This was something bigger. Helen's voice trembled. "Are we going to be okay?" Morgan placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "We've done what we can," he said. But even he knew it might not be enough. Another tremor hit, closer. The pavement beneath their feet cracked slightly, a thin line forming across the surface. Gasps rose from the crowd. The tension snapped. People began to run. Emergency crews shouted orders, trying to control the chaos. And then a section of the road, 2 blocks away, gave way. Not a full collapse, but a visible shift. The ground dipped, concrete fractured, and a hollow void opened beneath it. Memories filled the air. But something else happened too. Because the area had already been partially cleared. Because warnings had been given. Because action had been taken. People were not standing there when it happened. No one fell. No one was lost. The disaster had begun. But it hadn't taken lives. Not yet. And maybe not at all. Helen covered her mouth, tears forming in her eyes. "We stopped it," she whispered. Morgan shook his head slightly. "We slowed it," he said. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the fractured street, at the consequence of everything he had been part of, at the truth he had tried to control, and failed. The man in the coat turned back to him. "This is going public," he said. "All of it." Ethan nodded slowly. "I understand." "And so are you," the man added. Ethan didn't resist, because he knew. There was no version of this where he walked away untouched. Morgan stepped beside him. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. Ethan let out a hollow breath. "Too late," he replied. Morgan shook his head. "Not for them," he said, nodding toward the evacuated area. Ethan followed his gaze. People. Alive, if because of what had just happened, because of the truth. And for the first time, he didn't look at the damage. He looked at what hadn't been lost. Helen stepped closer to both of them, her voice soft. "We're still here," she said. Ethan looked at her, and something inside him finally gave way. Not completely, but enough. The city around them was shifting, cracking, changing. But for the first time, in a long time, something else was changing too. The truth had broken the surface, and nothing would ever be the same again. The city did not collapse. Not the way it could have, not the way the documents had warned. What followed instead was something slower, quieter, but no less powerful. A reckoning. Days turned into weeks, and the street of Cleveland transformed, not through destruction, but through exposure. Entire sections were shut down. Construction zones froze mid-progress, their skeletal frameworks standing still like monuments to something unfinished and deeply flawed. Barriers went up, investigations began, and the truth spread. News stations ran the story relentlessly, how a hidden chamber beneath the city had revealed structural failures buried for decades, how warnings had been ignored, how redevelopment plans had been rushed forward to cover something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. But more than anything, they told the story of the couple who found it. Morgan and Helen Adams. At first, their names were just details in a larger narrative. Footnotes in reports, faces briefly shown between headlines and expert analysis. But that didn't last. Because the more people learned, the more they understood. This wasn't just a story about infrastructure. It was a story about choices and the cost of them. Morgan sat quietly on a wooden bench outside a temporary housing facility provided by the city. The building wasn't much plain functional, far from the apartment he and Helen had lost, but it was safe. And for now, that was enough. Helen sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze watching the world move again, this time with a different awareness. People weren't rushing the same way anymore. They paused. They looked. They questioned. "Do you ever think about how close it came?" she asked softly. Morgan nodded. "Every day." Helen exhaled slowly. "I keep thinking about all those people, living their lives without knowing what was beneath them." Morgan looked out at the street. "That's how most things work," he said, "until something breaks." Helen turned slightly toward him. "And we were the ones who broke it open." Morgan gave a small, thoughtful nod. Yes, there was no pride in his voice, no sense of victory, just truth. Across the city, accountability unfolded piece by piece. Officials who had ignored early reports were questioned. Departments were audited. Contracts were examined. And at the center of it all was Ethan Adams. His name appeared more frequently than anyone else's. Not as a villain, but not as a hero either. Something more complicated. He had been part of the system that buried the truth. And then he had helped expose it. That contradiction didn't erase what he had done, but it didn't ignore what he chose to do at the end. The legal consequences came swiftly. Ethan faced investigations hearings and the slow unraveling of everything he had built. His company lost contracts. Investors pulled out. Projects were halted indefinitely. The empire he had worked so hard to create collapsed in a matter of days. But unlike the structures beneath the city, this collapse did not take innocent lives with it. And that mattered. Morgan watched it all unfold without celebration. Because this wasn't about winning, it was about truth. One afternoon, a familiar figure approached the bench. Ethan. He looked different, not physically at first glance, but something in his posture had changed. Less rigid, less certain, more human. He stopped a few steps away, unsure, as if he didn't know if he had the right to come closer. Helen saw him first. Her breath caught slightly. "Morgan?" she whispered. Morgan turned. Their eyes met, and for a moment everything that had happened stood between them, unspoken, heavy, undeniable. Ethan took a slow step forward. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me," he said. Morgan didn't respond immediately. Helen stood slowly. "You came," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something in between. Ethan nodded faintly. "I had to," he replied. Morgan studied him. "What for?" he asked. Ethan swallowed. "For the truth," he said. Then after a pause, "And for you." Helen's eyes softened, but only slightly. Truth should have come before everything else, she said gently. Ethan nodded. "I know." Morgan leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "And now?" he asked. Ethan looked down briefly, then back up. "Now, I deal with what I've done," he said. "No excuses." The simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation. Morgan held his gaze, then nodded once. "That's a start." A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable, but careful. Ethan looked at them, really looked this time. At the people he had pushed aside. The people who had still chosen to do what was right, even when it cost them everything. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. Helen stepped closer. "That's not something you ask for," she replied. "It's something you earn." Ethan nodded. "I understand." Morgan stood slowly. For a moment, he simply looked at his son, not at the man who had made the wrong choices, but at the person standing in front of him now. Changed. Not fixed, but changing. "We're not going back to what we were," Morgan said. Ethan didn't argue. "I know, but that doesn't mean there's nothing left," Morgan added. The words hung there, fragile, but real. Helen reached out, slightly hesitating for only a second, before placing her hand over Ethan's. It wasn't a full embrace. Not yet. But it was something. And sometimes, something is where everything begins again. Weeks later, the city began rebuilding. But differently this time. Slower, more carefully. Engineers worked from corrected plans. Inspections were no longer ignored. Public awareness remained high. And transparency became a necessity rather than a choice. The hidden weaknesses beneath the city were no longer secrets. They were lessons. Morgan and Helen chose not to return to their old life, because that life didn't exist anymore. Instead, they moved to a small rural town just outside the city, quiet, open, untouched by the chaos they had left behind. Their new home was simple, a small house with a wide porch and enough space to breathe. Helen planted flowers in the yard. Morgan repaired things that didn't need repairing, just to keep his hands busy, his mind steady. They didn't have much, but they had something they hadn't realized they lost before: peace. One evening, as the sun dipped low across the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the fields, Helen sat beside Morgan on the porch. The air was still, calm. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Morgan looked at her. "Regret what?" "Opening the wall," she said. Morgan turned his gaze toward the distance. The memory still lived clearly in his mind. The darkness, the dust, the first crack. "No," he said. Helen nodded softly. "Neither do I." They sat in silence for a while. Then Morgan spoke again. "We lost everything," he said. Helen smiled faintly. "Not everything." Morgan looked at her. She met his gaze. "We found out who we are," she said. The words settled between them, quiet but powerful, because in the end, that was what remained. Not the house, not the past, not even the pain, but the truth of who they chose to be when everything else fell away. And sometimes that is the greatest treasure of all.